Oh boy, how can I get rid of this? Okay. Um, Good morning, everybody. Day two of your of the training. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about adaptation, specifically focusing on managing for drought. Um, just a little bit of background about me. I am an environmental, cultural, psychological anthropologist. I wear a lot of hats. Here at the Center for Applied Social Research at the University of Oklahoma. I've been doing work. I've got sort of two major sort of projects, one of which involved research on watersheds all through Oklahoma. It was about a 5-year project, a lot of intensive in situ research looking at drought and water across a range of socio-ecological systems in Oklahoma. So very focused on sort of the state, but also kind of the watershed level. And then also generously funded research through the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, working on the Rio Grande and Rio Bravo, looking at drought and water management. That goes literally from the headwaters all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, includes portions of the Rio Conchos. So today's talk is specifically going to be focused on sort of talking through some of the elements in a paper that we have currently under review. One thing I like about this paper, it's about the typology of drought decision making in the Western United States. So really trying to understand drought preparedness and responsiveness from the standpoint of what is actually being done rather than what should be done. So we start with kind of a description of what's happening rather than starting from kind of an idealized form. With a lot of partners, if you take a look at this list, we have everybody from Fed folks, from USGS, USDA, to sort of your more standard issue academic types, and even some private folks in here. Specifically, I'm going to focus today on how our understanding of different typologies of drought decision-making might prove helpful for resource managers who are dealing with the evolving landscape of climate change-related drought challenges. So I'm going to break this up into the 4 elements that we've kind of identified, each of which has a number of dimensions. So it can get complicated, but I think if most folks on this call are resource managers, this is a fairly easy story to follow. So element 1 focuses on how drought is defined in practice in the first place. What you'll see is that I don't care about the book definitions of drought at this stage. What I really want to look at is what resource managers actually do, and to use that to figure out a typology. Element 2 actually looks at the question of who those actors are. Who we can count in the sort of universe of drought decision makers. Element 3 looks at the kinds of decisions that are usually made by drought managers and why this matters in a climate change impacted world. And finally, element 4 looks at how, why, and when interactions between drought decision makers impact. So the interactions is the key thing here. Impact the success of drought adaptation strategies. So we'll do a few interactive polls in between each of these brief discussions, though. I think I'm hoping that folks will add into the chat a few questions about why in the world these particular questions were included in this poll, because I'm trying to not only get information, but actually prompt you to think in a certain way. So Emma, if you can, could you launch poll number 1? We've run these polls before, and this one in particular takes about 2.5 minutes usually. You'll see there's a lot of repetition in the questions and the way that you answer them. So please dive right in. So I'd like to close this in about 20 seconds, 30 seconds, if possible. Okay, I'll close this in 10 seconds. All right. I mean, I'll do a quick share of the results. It's, this isn't a great way to show these polls. I'm not sure, Emma, how many polls have been done so far, but I apologize for the lack of ideal graphics here. But, this is kind of what Zoom gives you. So, obviously, it's interesting to me to see the sort of difference between folks who are going to give sort of explanations that are really heavily focused on drought limitations based on physical things, which we can see are sort of floating around the sort of that most people have given it that. I'm intrigued by the person who says not limited at all. Because I think that's really interesting. You can also see, obviously, a very high role that's being played by politics and policy. I like the sort of moderately driven by engineering and new technologies. Depending upon the audience that you're talking to, that can be extremely high, extremely low, and I think it's interesting that in our group that it's kind of in that moderate range. This issue of changing human behavior, I think that sort of fits into my wheelhouse. But again, what we have is a lot of balance across all of these things. Almost everything is in the moderately to significantly driven category. There are very few cases here where one says that it's entirely driven by one or the other. So we have one person who said that it was entirely driven by natural and physical processes, and one person who says it's entirely driven by human behavior and perception of problems of drought. But beyond that, you see that this complex mix of factors, and everything is kind of moderately or significantly for most people. I think tells us the sort of complexity of some of these challenges that we're facing, that they're not just a physical problem. It's not just a problem with people or politics or the economy, but it's this combination of factors. All right, so let me move back to my slides. Whoops, and talk a little bit about the four elements that we have in our typology. So element one focuses on how drought is framed as a problem and why that matters in understanding adaptation to climate change influence drought. Our research brought together a number of different elements that play into the definition of drought problems. So first, we saw that some drought decisions focused on drought as a primary problem and others as a secondary problem. That might not be really obvious what I mean there, but I'll explain it in the next slide. Hopefully it'll be a little clearer. On the other hand, I suspect that these next two elements are very clear, that that how one defines drought as a spatial problem versus a temporal problem will be much more obvious to many of you. In some cases, we have actors, so drought managers who are very clear about the type of drought that they're thinking through. Meteorological, agricultural, hydrological, or sort of a new and growing or evolving element or way of framing drought, which is ecological. And then how much folks are defining drought based on their definition of drivers versus impacts, and how much they define whether or not they're in a drought or drought is a problem based on their requirements to be proactive. So focusing on preparedness versus reactive, all of which seem like very different elements, and they are very different elements. There's no way I can talk about all of these. We'll be here for hours. So I'm just going to focus on a couple that I think are maybe a little bit either unclear or very illustrative. So the one that I think is the more unclear one is this issue of primary versus secondary. And yet I think it's really important. I'm going to use an example from our research in the Rio Grande. In different parts of the Rio Grande, resource managers consider drought in different ways. For some, drought itself is the driver, meaning that they assume that the environment determines the actions that they can take. Too little water leads to requirements to implement various portions of water treaties and agreements. You can think of this as kind of algorithm thinking. We're lacking water, therefore we immediately click this switch. And in turn, this forces humans to take specific actions. So this is what I would term the environment determinist model of behavior. In other portions, though, of the Rio Grande, managers see that it was specific human actions in the first place, the way that water is consumed, the impact of reservoirs, the role of agriculture, etc., that has created the drought conditions. In other words, that yes, you might have limited precipitation during a particular year, but that would not be cascading into catastrophic agricultural or other ways of thinking about agricultural or hydrological drought if we didn't have this sort of human engineering of the landscape in a particular way. So each of these ways of framing the problem of drought ends up defining the decisions that can be made. And this is what I mean by drought as primary versus drought as secondary. Perhaps probably a more obvious way of thinking about the way that we define drought is sort of from a temporal standpoint. So time obviously has a big role to play here because it defines when we are in a drought and when should that drought trigger a response. When management needs to shift from business as usual to drought contingency practices. When will a sustained drought overwhelm a drought plan, and what will that mean? And when are we out of a drought, and what follows? Each of these each of these questions, each of these sort of dimensions, end up defining kind of how a drought is defined in the first place. And again, we recorded all of these different ways of thinking about this from the drought managers and resource managers who were included in all of our studies in all of these different places in the West. So again, I'm just reporting on the Rio Grande portion, but the co-authors on the study were doing work all throughout the West. Element 2 in our typology simply looks at who counts as a drought decision maker. So we very quickly realized in our study that falling back on simple job titles or job descriptions was inadequate if we wanted to understand a typology of drought decision making. Thus, while most formal drought managers were also types of resource managers, we quickly realized that we could not exclude, for instance, farmers and ranchers whose decisions before, during, and after a drought could often mean the difference between drought and not drought. At the same time, we were acutely aware that some people who manage resources actually don't have much agency. Meaning the power and ability to effect a change or take a desired action. So they might not be included in our typology. This is the kind of lever puller idea that somebody sort of gets an order and their job actually is simply, figuratively or literally pull a lever. They're very important for the flow of water or for decisions that are made, but they might actually not be making those decisions. Finally, we also considered whether or not an actor was primarily tasked with making drought decisions for themselves. So that would be sort of their households, farm, ranch, business, etc., or whether they were responsible for acting in the collective best interest. So each of these dimensions also kind of shaped the type of drought adaptation planning that we were able to observe in our research. And all of this leads me away from my rambling and lecturing, and hopefully moves us into something, again, a little more interactive. So at this point, Emma, can you launch poll number 2? And hopefully you'll see the thematic similarity here. Again, this poll usually takes about 2.5 minutes. We'll see whether or not we sort of stick to that, but go ahead, jump on in. And you'll see there's a lot of opt-out answers for those of you who are not resource managers at all. So I'll close this in about 35 seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this. It looks like there are just a couple of people who haven't jumped in. I hope that's okay. I hate cutting people off, but this is one of the sort of key things that we found in our research as I was sort of driving home with this sort of discussion in the first place, is that if you just focus on people whose formal roles is something having to do with drought, you end up with very few people. Instead, drought falls under many other people's category, a sort of a broader umbrella. So we have a lot of people who don't think at all that their job is to manage for drought in this community. Again, I'm not sure who's on today. I got a list in the first place of some people are academics. We've got a lot of other kinds of resource managers. And yet, as you sort of work your way through, people are aware enough of the fact that their organization broadly might be managing for drought. I think across the board, it looks like only about a third of the folks who answered things actually are in an organization that does not manage for drought, which means that everybody else, they're sort of becoming very aware. And you can see this nice split between regions, where people are managing, as well as the different kinds of types of drought that they're managing for. I would be really interested to see what ecological drought actually means for other folks. If anybody wants to throw anything into the comments about ecological drought means blank for our organization. I know this is kind of very rapid paced here, so you might not have time to do it, but I would love to hear what you're thinking in terms of those terms and how it kind of plays itself out. Also, I think it's incredibly telling that nobody thinks that their organization is managing for the drivers of drought. Everybody is mostly managing for the impacts of drought, and that I think is very telling. And it's also interesting to me, the sort of balance between preparedness and response. Although it looks like I might have cut this off a little early. I'm sorry if I did. We're going to run out of time otherwise because there aren't as many responses for this last question. So I'm going to stop sharing. I want to move on so I don't run out of time here.
It does look like you have someone, Chris says ecological drought to him means threats to at-risk species and natural communities.
Yeah, and that's really the sort of way to think through it, especially if you look at published work by at least some of the co-authors that are on the current paper that we have, that this is under review, who were involved with kind of this broad effort by a bunch of USGS people and other folks to try and define what eco-drought would mean, how it's different than, related to, but different than the three other traditional ways of thinking about drought. So it's nice to hear that that's the way that folks are thinking about it. So let me move on to the third element in our typology. Getting back to this typology, element 3 looks at the different types of decisions that are made regarding adaptation to and response to drought. And so first and foremost, what we had to figure out was what was a decision. This is important for us because in order to be a decision, one has to be able to consciously make a choice between multiple options, and that there must be some level of judgment here. And again, what we're trying to distinguish, we need to make a distinction between those who do something before, during, and after a drought, and those who are driving adaptation to droughts. For instance, a dam operator might be critical for the release of water before, during, and after a drought, but in some cases, in many cases, not in all cases, they're simply tasked with releasing or not releasing based on decisions that are passed on to them by irrigation districts, federal resource managers, the owners of water, however you want to look at it. Second, we also considered whether the scale of the management decision matched the scale of the drought problem. So we needed to be able here to distinguish the sort of case of every single individual citizen's actions and decisions could be seen as drought management, which we thought was too difficult to sort of manage that as a drought management typology, versus sort of larger scale drought management decisions. Again, it's not that every individual actor's decisions don't matter. They obviously do, but it's usually it's the scaling of these things. In the Rio Grande, I'll just do this very quickly. The types of decisions we ended up sort of identifying often as an example of this kind of clustered into several different categories. Most drought decisions we noticed were responsive only to local conditions, and they failed to account for what are called teleconnections. They failed to account for often what was going on way upstream, or in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, in sort of making these decisions. Most drought decisions shifted the burden of a drought to downstream users. You made a decision based on your own group, your own constituents. And that's what your job was, so that's why they did it. But then that shifted the burden to downstream users of the river. Most drought decisions did not provide resilience to drought impacts. Drought plans simply concealed and deferred the impact of a drought. Most drought decisions were viewed as successful if the response made the drought invisible to their constituents as long as possible. And that most drought decisions were viewed as successful if regular people, the constituents, never experienced these water-limited but manageable situations. Again, we're seeing that the kinds of logics that drive a drought decision can inform the typologies of drought decision-making. But you can also then see the implications if you look a little deeply, scratch at the surface. You can see the implications of why a successful drought decision might actually be very problematic broadly. If the publics never feel drought, then the drought decision was good, but then that might never lead to longer term changing. With that in mind, very quickly, let's move on to poll number 3, which is very short. It's got a lot of answers, but it's actually very short. And one thing I want to stress is that first question is multiple choices. So select all that apply. Okay, I'd like to close this in about 30 seconds. All right, I'm going to close this now. So, share results. So, obviously, what I was hoping to see was obviously a lot of people who are being served. I was expecting that, rather than folks who might just say that they're serving one actor or one constituency. Um, and you clearly see that across here. It's not just that one, for instance, is serving the federal government. Almost always you have that narrative somewhere in your job description that when you're serving the federal government, you're serving all American citizens or something like that. But it's this diversity of the people who everybody is serving, I think, is critical. You can obviously add all the numbers up here, and it goes well over our 16 participants. The issue then ends up being how is it that you coordinate, and it looks like there's quite a bit of coordination and active coordination and ways of working with other groups to bring to bring yourselves together to deal with drought problems. But I really wanted to focus on that last question to start with. It was sort of it I think is a real challenging question, because often this is the first thing one hears when you start to say, hey, can you make this tough decision, from a drought manager? And they'll say, well, I can't do that because the people who I'm serving right now will not allow me to do that, even if it seems it might be good in the long run. So this is hopeful that a lot more folks are saying yes. And I'm not surprised that we have at least one person saying no, because I think that is often the political reality, that one faces, in practice. All right, so I have 1 minute left to get through, a couple of slides, but I'll just ignore most of them, and just hit you with the very last element in this, in our typology. So so obviously these questions were kind of about interactions and the importance of interactions, and how they play themselves out. And so we ask a number of questions, in deciding what the role of interactions is in defining kind of a drought manager. The connections between drought decisions, what relationship there is between different actors, whether they do share decision spaces, whether the decisions of one actor are going to constrain or enable another actor, across a sort of a broad drought problem. How feedbacks work across these different decision spaces, and to what extent do decisions and actors interact across multiple spatial and temporal scales. Again, going back to our sort of Rio Grande cases, we could define different kinds of actors in the Rio Grande, and often what we found was that there were disconnects between many of them on a temporal level when they made decisions and how they made decisions. The classic case being irrigators, mostly making decisions on a seasonal scale on a certain level, some making decisions on an annual scale. But then once you deal with decadal, nobody was making decisions based on that for good reason, for reasonable reasons. And similarly, one sees these sort of silos that make certain interactions possible, but in the sort of spatial decision making, but also make it very difficult for other folks, to join these conversations. I've basically run out of time. The point with all of this, is that you have to understand what actual resource managers do rather than what they should do, before you can come up with a way of sort of working toward an adaptive future.